So, good evening, and on behalf of the Polish Institute in Berlin, I would like to welcome you all to this evening to the third edition of the Focus Architecture series, organized by the Polish Institute in Berlin. Tonight's evening event is Focus Architecture number 3, the rebuilding of Warsaw. My name is Kristien Ring. I'm an architect, author, and curator based in Berlin. And tonight I'll be questioning our expert on the rebuilding of Warsaw, Grzegorz Piątek, who published a book this year entitled The Best City in the World, Warsaw in Reconstruction, from 1945 to 1949. Grzegorz Piątek is a Polish architect. He's a critic and a historian of architecture. And 2005 to 2011, he was the editor of Architektur, the monthly architecture journal in Poland. And since 2011, he was also a member of the board of the Foundation Centrum Architektury. He graduated from the Faculty of Architecture at the Warsaw University of Technology in 2006, and since he's had a long list of impressive awards and accomplishments as a curator and an author. We will also be talking about Warsaw since this time period covered in his book, till after 49, as this year marks the 75th anniversary of the start of this huge undertaking. The last 75 years of reconstruction has shaped the contemporary appearance of the capital, and it still is a source of national pride, but also of much controversy. Warsaw embodies diverse examples of modern architecture and urban planning, and as well as the accompanying processes that shape a modern city. And it is these aspects that we'll be talking about tonight. And we'd like to devote our attention first to the historical context. Obviously, Warsaw was terribly destroyed in World War II. I believe over 85% of its buildings were in ruins. That's, for some perspective, even more than the destruction of Berlin, slightly. So, Mr. Piątek, can you give us a short historical context so that we can envision the starting point of this rebuilding?
Good evening, Mrs. Ring. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you tonight, and because I think that the reconstruction of Warsaw is indeed an impressive undertaking that is not sufficiently known outside of Poland, and even in Poland, as you have already mentioned, is often controversial, is often underrated, and I think we should give some credit back to the people who made it happen. And what happened in 1944, 1945 is that, as you already said, most of the buildings in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, were destroyed. It didn't happen in one take. The destruction started already in 1939 during the German invasion, but then only 10% of the buildings were destroyed. And the city quite quickly came back to its more or less normal appearance. But then came the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, and then the Warsaw Uprising in the rest of the city. And as a result of both of these events, most of the buildings of the city were destroyed. 500,000 people were fled from the city after the uprising. So instead of a 1 million metropolis that Warsaw was before the war, there was just a sea of rubble and no people in the city. And it's important to mention that it wasn't really it wasn't so certain that Warsaw will be rebuilt. After all, the whole country was destroyed. There was no money, no materials. We lost a lot of people, and some people, some in the government, some policymakers, some politicians argued that we cannot afford to rebuild Warsaw. That it would probably make more sense to relocate the central government to some other city, probably to Łódź, west of Warsaw, which was not so damaged, and to leave this task for the for the future generations. Quite amazingly, people started to go back to the city on the very first day, in January 45 already. So this sea of ruins started to fill up with people who were just going back to their city, even though it was just a name on the tag on the map, not a real city, real functioning city, and trying to find shelter there in the ruins. So there was no way, and there was no way to stop people from flooding back into the city. And secondly, it turned out that that reconstructing Warsaw is a very important task from an emotional, symbolic, political standpoint. It was a way to fight this terrible mood that the nation and the people in Warsaw had after the war. A way to counterbalance all the suffering and all the destruction that the city suffered. And also, it quickly turned out that it's very important from a political point of view for the new communist government to start rebuilding the city as quickly as possible, and to prove that they're an efficient government, and to prove that they're a government that has a right to a legitimate government. The reconstruction of Warsaw became a very important political project because it was a positive, constructive project that could unite people, even if they were skeptical of the new government, or even if they were indifferent. It was a way to put people to work and to say a noble cause that no one could that no one would dispute, and no one would underestimate. So it was to rebuild Warsaw seemed like an impossible task in early 45. But we took on this task nevertheless.
So, can you tell me then, were there different ideologies about how the rebuilding should look, or was there something like a vision that the government wanted to convey in this rebuilding?
There was what I find amazing about this story is that even though the decisions had to be taken very quickly, the strategic decisions about the plan for the city and its layout and its basic composition, everyone was ready, because planners and architects kept on working on the vision for the future Warsaw throughout the war. Some of them did it more officially, working for official institutions. Some of them were just doing this in their spare time, because architects didn't have much work, especially in the last phase of the war. So they had a lot of time on their hands, and they were discussing the whole time about the way Warsaw should look like, and it was the case both the architects who lived in Warsaw, but also the émigré architects in Britain and some other places. So everyone was discussing about Warsaw, and when this opportunity came in early 1945, they were ready. And there were a lot of discussions about the details, about certain, buildings, certain typologies, certain streets. But some ideas were shared by most of the community of architects and planners. What they knew for sure is that they do not want to rebuild the city as it was before the war. They saw this disaster as a blessing in disguise, as an historic opportunity to give this Warsaw a new shape and to avoid the mistakes of the past. And there were lots of mistakes. Today we tend to mythologize the pre-war Warsaw, the Warsaw of the 20s, the 30s, the 19th century. But the generations who lived through the reality of the pre-war city were very critical. They thought Warsaw is not a functional city. They didn't like the density. Warsaw was one of the most dense cities in Europe when it comes to both the population density and building density, and the repercussions. You can imagine. Lack of greenery, lack of daylight in the apartments, very bad apartments. So they wanted to seize this opportunity to raise the standard of living in the future city, to give the city a logical layout, to introduce much more greenery, to rebuild monuments, historic monuments, more beautiful, better than they were originally. That's also quite a paradoxical thing, but this was the case.
And so what were the main approaches at that time?
Well, you can see when you study the plans for post-war Warsaw, you can clearly see that the planners and architects in Poland were clearly under the influence of the Charter of Athens, of Le Corbusier, of Siam. So they wanted, and this dream was, had already its history, in the 30s and the 40s. They wanted to rebuild Warsaw as a functional city. With a clearly defined central zone for offices, for the seat of the government, big department stores, hotels. So a city, surrounded by modernist residential districts, by industrial zones, and all of these functional zones would be very clearly connected with the transit system, divided with green belts. So, the quality of air, the access to greenery was also very important in this vision. And with a very tiny historic core rebuilt, so just the medieval old town, the royal route with the Baroque palaces and churches would be rebuilt. But otherwise, in this first vision, which was then slightly compromised, the whole city would be rebuilt or constructed in a new way, in a radically new modernist way.
So from the beginning, it was actually a vision that was then rolled out, and everything basically followed suit. Is that right, or were there various phases of?
There were various phases, and this romantic period of very bold planning could not last forever, because you had the reality. On the other hand, you had the reality of a city that comes back to life on its own, spontaneously. There was a self-made city already living in 45 in Warsaw, in the center. People rebuilding their own the houses that they even their own houses, or the houses that they just took over because nobody cared about ownership so much in the first few months, or people just setting up businesses wherever they could, building from scrap material. So you had this. You also had houses that survived, and even though in the first visions planners tended to ignore the existing fabric, some fabric did survive. And it was too useful in this first period to be just demolished after the war, because housing was desperately needed. Office space for the government was desperately needed. Schools, hospitals. So you could not wipe out these buildings that survived in the name of a planning doctrine or a better future. And then the politics was rearing its ugly head more and more. The urban planners, the architects were given a lot of freedom by the government because the communist government wanted results as quickly as possible. So there were very powerful planning tools given to the architects, to the BOS, the city of the Reconstruction Bureau, that was in charge of this whole undertaking. So on one hand, architects became very powerful and very also cherished by the government, used in the propaganda and given quite a good atmosphere to work in. But politicians wanted not just results in the practical meaning, but they also wanted certain political results. So then comes 1949. That's the reason why I chose it as the, let's say, the closing date of my story in the book, which is the definite end of this romantic period, when the communist government seizes most of the power in the country, when also in architecture, architects are demanded to build in the Soviet way, not their own way, inspired by different influences from around Europe. So this is when architecture changes, when the approach to city planning changes slightly, and that's what happened. In very general terms, of course.
So, who was it that, first of all, initiated the reconstruction of Warsaw, and then who was responsible for the main decisions, at least in that first time period? And then maybe you can jump forward and tell us some more about how that then was affected by the change of the Romantic period to more the realities that came after.
Yeah, the socialist realism. The most, if you ask me who decided to, who was responsible for the decision to rebuild Warsaw, it was actually Stalin who instructed the communist government in Poland that he installed to take on this to embark on this project, even though it didn't make much practical sense, or it was very costly. So what happened in the beginning of 45, as I already mentioned, there were a lot of people in the government who were saying that this project should be delayed, and put on hold. But then the communist president Bierut, who was just taking over power in Poland, flew to Moscow to see Stalin, and Stalin directly instructed him to say yes to reconstruction. He said that as long as your government will rule from another city, it will not be taken seriously by the nation. That Warsaw is the city where you rule Poland from. This is where the seat of the government needs to be. And if you need to install the government in Warsaw, you need to rebuild the rest of the city. And we actually got some really, in the first period, some very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very help from the Soviet Union, first phase of the reconstruction, because it was important to legitimize the government. But in terms of the planning itself, there was no single person, and I often get this question: who was the father of the vision of Warsaw? Who was who created this vision? And it was very much a collective work. There were certain people who were more important in the structures, but the strategic discussions were taken collectively, and they also. I already said that architects and planners were discussing the shape of the future city already during the war, as a, and they were discussing, it was also a collective undertaking then, and some strategic decisions were already made during the war. And also from a political point of view, these architects were from the whole, political spectrum. They were very, they could differ in terms of their political affiliation or political, opinion. They could like the communist government or not, or be indifferent. But they were quite united in this, in their opinion about the future of the city, modernist vision of a green, functionalist city. And it's another thing that amazes me, and it's quite, it runs contrary to this black and white vision of history, that on the one hand you have the bad communists, and on the other side you have the good non-communists. The architects were on very good terms with the government, even if they did not disagree with the government on other things. When it comes to architecture, they were quite, and it worked on different levels. For instance, when I said that the whole city would get a new structure, that meant getting rid of a lot of commercial architecture from 19th century, from the Industrial Revolution, like the Mitkazerne that we already had also had in Warsaw. Warsaw was a boomtown that grew very quickly in 19th century, much like Berlin, and there were lots of very bad tenement houses. So architects didn't want this structure to be rebuilt, this 19th century capitalist commercial structure, for purely technocratic, hygienic, aesthetic reasons. But the government also supported that, because it helped to achieve their political goal, which was getting rid of or weakening the bourgeoisie, the middle class, who owned those houses, this tenement houses or commercial buildings. So there were lots of cases where this technocratic, let's say, these professional goals matched the goals of the government.
Oh, that's really interesting. So beyond that, what was the influence of the Soviets and their communist institutions in Poland during that reconstruction?
So it also changed over time. In the first period, the first 3 or 4 years, you can say that the institutions responsible for reconstruction, both in Warsaw and across the nation, were not very politicized. I don't know if this word exists, but you know what I mean.
Yes. Yes.
And they were very professional. And then in 1949, not just in architecture, in every single field of every single activity, whether it's sports, culture, industry, agriculture, comes this very heavy Sovietization, and this, and also the people in charge have to be, part of the communist establishment. And this Stalinist period starts. This heavy Stalinist period starts in 1949. Then lasts until the mid 50s, much like in other Eastern Bloc countries. So we had, after 49, we had these 5 or 6 years of Soviet-style architecture. Before, the vision of Warsaw was influenced by all sorts of ideas, Siam ideas, the Dutch and German ideas about housing, but also the neighborhood unit idea of a housing community, which was Anglo-American. So before 49, this is why I call it a romantic period, because it was a period where influences could be taken from anywhere, and there was a continuity also with the work Polish architects and planners were doing before the war. Not just architects and planners, but also housing activists, who were studying cooperatives, all sorts of other experts. There was a continuity between the pre-war and the post-war. In 1949 comes a very deep cut and a period of Sovietization.
So beyond aesthetics, in terms of how the kind of Stalinist architecture was rolled out then after 1949, was it also a really great change in the planning of what had been the vision beforehand?
Yes and no, because some of the main goals were never questioned, like the reducing density, introducing greenery, etc. Some solutions were just labeled as Soviet, but they were still the same. That's a very, very a lot of things happen just in the rhetoric. For instance, the idea of creating housing estates as neighborhood units was never questioned. But in the rhetoric, the magazines, it was claimed that it's not an Anglo-Saxon idea, that is something that started in the Soviet Union. Whether it was, imported to Soviet Union and then back to imported to Soviet Union from Britain and America. What happened is that after 49, in this, what's changed in the planning is that there was an even more emphasis put on, let's say, ceremonial spaces, like spaces for big parades, for big. So the city was thought of as a scenery for mass gatherings, for mass parades, and it was like a scenery for the government. Also, a thing that I think changed, a positive change came after 49, is that in the first visions of the reconstruction, as I already mentioned, the center of the city was reserved just for public functions, for offices, for government, for cultural institutions, no housing, which means that the city center would be very difficult to animate. It would be like after working hours, the streets would be empty. It would be like the EUR outside of Rome. This government district started by Mussolini and then developed after the war. So just ministries, just cultural institutions, convention centers. And after 49, for economical reasons, it was decided that we need housing as well in the center, and it was introduced in the center, and I think it's because of this we avoided a very big mistake, because this first vision of I'll try to make the best out of this. In this first vision after 45, you can see it's like a diagram. Everything's very simple, divided into zones. A city is not a diagram. And after 49, this radical vision was compromised a bit, and I think, especially in the center of the city, it was a change. It was a positive change.
You hadn't mentioned that, so I'm glad that you mentioned and went into detail about the housing and the mix of the city and how that evolved. That's really good. So basically, the vision versus the reality of what happened has really transformed and morphed over time. So maybe a few details about the the reconstruction, I believe there's also, as you mentioned, the old town, the part of Warsaw that was actually rebuilt, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was meticulously reconstructed. What were some of the ideas behind how it was reconstructed, from what time period that reconstruction happened, and how did that affect the building of the rest of the reconstruction of the rest of the city?
Yeah, good question. The ideas about reconstruction of the historic monuments, it's also quite interesting, is that they also had a long history. Already before the war, so before this big destruction, the Warsaw, let's say, conservationists and architects responsible for the preservation of historic monuments, they were very frustrated that Warsaw does not look old enough. That even though it's a city with a long history, it used to be the seat of Polish kings, it doesn't look like an old city because it grew so fast in 19th century during the Industrial Revolution that the new structure, this commercial structure of speculative housing and factories and commercial buildings just completely covered the historic monuments. And I think it's true. Warsaw did not resemble an age-old city that it was. So already before the war, these architects were dreaming of an opportunity to give the city a more historic look. So, for instance, to be able to renovate the historic buildings in a way that brings out their beauty and their original form. And this opportunity came, it's another paradox, this thanks to the destruction, it was a blessing in disguise. You have dozens of historic monuments to be rebuilt, and you can give them the desired form. So, and the general rule was that buildings should resemble their original form from before 19th century. So from before this period of rapid growth of the city, when so much of the beauty of the old city was lost. Even though the architects like Jan Zachwatowicz, who was in charge of this, he was the father of this doctrine, realized that the modern, the 20th century doctrine of monument preservation that started with Alois Riegl, it's about the original substance, and basically it prefers original substance over beauty and over creation. They felt that since the city suffered so much, since we lost so much substance, we are free to I'd hate to say to use the word lie, because it's I think it's too strong, but we are free to create. We are free to
interpret,
shape this. I'm sorry?
To interpret.
Yeah, to interpret, to choose the desired form of the buildings, and to it's like we have a moral right to manipulate these buildings. And it's quite astonishing right now if you would walk through the old town and the royal route, look at the palaces, the churches, the burger houses, and the pictures from 1935 or 1930, you would see quite different buildings, because they are not the same. They don't look the way they looked in 1939 and 44 before they were destroyed. They often look like an older version of themselves. Sometimes it's also quite a different version, like the cathedral in the old town. The facade of the cathedral was completely invented after the war. because the cathedral was medieval, but the Gothic facade was lost, very early on. Then it had a Baroque facade, then Gothic revival facade, blah blah blah, and nobody really knew what the medieval facade, original facade, looked like. There are no pictures, no iconography. And Jan Zachwatowicz, the architect who designed this facade, he invented it. He made this, scientific guess of what a facade of a Gothic cathedral in this part of Europe probably would look like, compared to other cities and other churches from this period. So it's a very meticulous, it's a reconstruction and a very intricate creation at the same time.
Wow. So architects were basically, in conjunction with other planners in the city, able to really create the look of the city, of what we see today. So were there landmark? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. And sorry to interrupt, but I think that there's another interesting alignment with the government. That the communist government, you would expect interest in history because they were, building a completely new society, and they were installed by the Soviet Union, but they needed this, tradition to reconstruct the traditional, to reconstruct some historic buildings and to themselves as a Polish government, interested in Polish culture and not just, an imported government. So they were also very strongly supporting even rebuilding of the churches. That's another paradox, that historic churches in Warsaw were rebuilt with very big support, also financial support from the communist government.
So were there actually landmark buildings or areas of the city, for example, neighborhoods that were left unreconstructed? And were there reasons behind what was constructed and what was not reconstructed?
The most heavily transformed parts of the city are the parts that used to have this very dense 19th century capitalist structure, with very high density and commercial buildings. That's a big part of the center, of the modern center. And also, the most striking example is Muranów. It's a new neighborhood built on the ruins of the Ghetto. The Ghetto was huge in Warsaw because it was, even before the war, 30% of the population of Warsaw was Jewish. So the Jewish neighborhoods were covered quite a big percentage of the area of the city. So, and then in 1940, the German occupation authorities turned this area into a ghetto. And after the fall of the uprising of the ghetto, this whole area was completely demolished. Whatever was left after the fighting was very, very methodically demolished. So this was the area that was a perfect tabula rasa for the planners after the war, both in the material sense, because there were hardly any buildings left, and also in the social sense, since nearly all the inhabitants were exterminated. There was nobody who would go like in other parts of the city. There was nobody to come back there, claim something back. You had a clean slate completely, and it's quite it was quite astonishing for me when I was researching for this book how let's say cold and professional the Polish planners were about this area, that they were already planning for it during the war, and some of them were even writing, with you could sense a bit of relief that this area is all cleaned out and ready for new development, because it was one of these, super dense areas of the city before the war. It had a very bad press. And they were just, the most of the architects and planners that wrote about this were very keen to jump on the opportunity and never even mentioned the tragedy that happened in this area. So it's quite astonishing.
In that way, were parts of that city basically, like with the new planning, was that the intrinsic characteristic of the Jewish quarter or even financial districts, were they erased with the new planning or changed or moved around to other parts of the city?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question. The first part
was were parts of the characteristics or the attributes of different areas of the city. For example, the Jewish district, was that identity erased then with the new planning? Was it? It's no longer, of course, the Jewish district. Was that also the case with other attributes? Maybe, for example, the government district changing places, the financial districts changing places.
Well, the initial idea was to break free from the past entirely. Then it was in other parts of the city. Of course, it was compromised later for the reasons I already mentioned. Like you could not ignore the buildings that survive, or the government. In the first visions of the city, the government would get completely new buildings for the parliament and other institutions, but it made more sense in the first period to just quickly rebuild the pre-war government, the seat of the parliament, for instance. But the general idea was to break free from this recent past, this capital city of 19th century, and to either create a futuristic new structure or to highlight the historic elements from before 19th century. So it's as if the city was meant to forget the last 150 years and think either of the distant past or the near future.
So were there any attributes or any, let's say, characteristics that were very specifically not taken into the new Warsaw? Was there any, what was pushed behind or left behind specifically?
Well, I think that this mixed use, high density structure of the 19th century capitalist city with, all those speculative housing with small courtyards. I use the word mitkazana. I think it's so this was basically the biggest burden that was meant to be disposed.
So more of a planning and architectural change.
Yeah. Narrow streets.
Than an ideological.
Yeah. Of course, it had its ideological ramifications. Is what I as I mentioned before, getting rid of this capitalist structure, urban structure also meant saying goodbye to this whatever was left of the capitalist social structure. So it had a political, under a political layer.
Oh. And so, what is how was the reconstruction effort and its result generally perceived by the public?
It's a very tricky question, and I struggled with this throughout my research, The problem with this period is that things were happening so fast, and it is not. And at this point, nobody was. There was. You didn't have the techniques we have nowadays to study, to survey public opinion. So what we have is we have very few sources. Of course, you have diaries, you have letters, you have these private sources that give you a bit of an idea of what people thought, but they are very quite few. And then you have the official sources. You have the press, which was controlled by the government, so it was not, it cannot be entirely trusted. But so whatever I'm going to say is my approximation. I think that there was indeed lots of enthusiasm and optimism, and support for the actions of the planners on a very general level. I think that a lot of people wanted a better city and wanted this, greener, more efficient, more functional city. But then when you come back, when you look closer at certain buildings, certain spaces, certain solutions, there was also a lot of what we now call Nimbyism, not in my backyard. So people didn't like the changes to specific, or would oppose changes to specific places in their neighborhood. Sometimes it was for purely emotional, psychological reasons. Sometimes it meant, for instance, people were frustrated by the fact that certain buildings that survived the war were meant to be demolished. Because people didn't see any sense in that. Since most of the buildings are demolished, why are you demolishing another one that survived the war? And the planners would say that, well, we need to make this street wider, or we need to build a school, or we need to plant a park here. So they were thinking, 5, 10, 20 years ahead, while people were thinking. Most of them in the first period were thinking of how to survive the next day, because there was so little food, so little housing, etc. It was a city after a huge disaster. So there was this constant friction between the planners who were thinking ahead and were actually getting more and more frustrated that they didn't get the tabula rasa they thought they're getting, and who wanted to seize this historic opportunity to build a better city, and regular people in the street who were who didn't have that perspective and were interested in getting a room, not even a flat, a room or a bed, and getting something to eat. And so there was this constant friction between idealism and let's say pragmatism of the everyday people. And then of course you have I'm certain that some people were thinking that it's just communist propaganda, that we're using every opportunity to criticize any mistakes or any bad ideas, and seeing this whole huge undertaking as just some phony propaganda exercise. So it's a really complex issue. But overall, I think that the optimism and the support were stronger than the skepticism.
And did that change and evolve over the next decades?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
I mean, after the time period in your book. Yeah.
Definitely. What I find interesting is that very quickly, in the first very few years, it was easy to convince people to make sacrifices and to wait for this better city, and people were quite okay with waiting. But then 5-6 years on, they were just, this memory of the war and of the starting point was diminishing, and people were expecting results. People wanted to live in this promised city, which was going up very, very slowly, not fast enough to satisfy everyone. And it's very telling that I studied a lot of memoirs and diaries of different people when I was researching this book. So there's, for example, this story of a man who lives for the first 5 years after the war, lives in a room in a ruined building without any heating. So you can imagine how he slept, how he lived through the winters, without anything. So you just have the walls, the window, and the ceiling in the ruins. And in 1949, he gets a modern apartment. So for people like him, he waited through these 5 years, and he got this modern living after 5 years. But most of the people were waiting for these modern apartments for 10, 15, 20 years. The housing problem was not really resolved in Warsaw until the late 60s, early 70s. So, this frustration with this this contrast between the lofty visions of the planners and the reality of the lived-in city was, caused a lot of frustration. And then in the 70s, when the situation was already, the city looked like and functioned like a normal city at last. Then you have a new generation of the inhabitants in Warsaw who did not remember either, who had no first-hand experience neither of the war or this first heroic period of reconstruction. And they, and then you have postmodernist ideas, this whole critique of modernist planning that comes in from the West with Jane Jacobs and with Venturi and Christopher Alexander. These texts were these ideas were familiar among architects in Warsaw. And they start to see this post-war reconstruction as a embodiment of the most radical, most this horrific top-down planning that is often associated with modernism. So they saw this modern city that they got as an embodiment of these ideas, and also what I find quite striking is that when you have this new generation, not just professionals but also regular people who don't remember, who don't have the first-hand experience of this pre-war city, they start to develop this second-hand nostalgia for the lost pre-war city. And start asking, why this building was not rebuilt? Why this street doesn't look the way it looks like in 39? Oh, it was so pretty. It has these pretty houses, pretty shops, pretty cafes, and Warsaw was Paris of the North. So this becomes a huge trend, not just in the professional circles, but in the public opinion. This second-hand nostalgia for a pre-war city lost in the war and not regained during the reconstruction. And this feeds into a very wide, very popular, let's say, criticism of post-war reconstruction. So what I was raised on I started getting interested in the history of the city in the 90s when I was a teenager. So what I remember from the press from this period of after 89 is just articles about the buildings that were not rebuilt after the war, and a lot of criticism towards the architects and the planners, lots of suggestions that were acting on the instruction of Soviet Union, and all this. Even though the most beautiful aspects of this period that I write about this book, this romantic period, are tied into this, let's say, it all becomes a cruel communist project to kill the pre-war Warsaw. It becomes so absurd that even in some writing, let's say the amount of destruction of the war destruction was lowered, and the amount of the demolitions that took place after the war was pumped up to place as much blame on both on the government and the architects from the post-war period.
But on the other hand, if you have a look around Europe, there are similar patterns of construction, of thought, of planning and design of the post-war reconstruction, and the same kind of problematic, and then the same ideologies that happen not only in the East, not only Berlin, for example, but also in Western Europe. European cities. So, is there some kind of, do you think, exchange in ideologies that you can see from what Warsaw, for example, has learned from their reconstruction? And can other cities, or have other cities looked to Warsaw as an example, or vice versa? Has there been...
You mean in the ideas for reconstruction, or in this whole long-term, let's say, this change of attitude?
Yes, the long-term change in attitude, re-looking at what modernism and the rebuilding of the city was, and the qualities that it had, and kind of reversing that.
Yeah, I think it's quite striking how similar these trends were, regardless of which side of the Iron Curtain we talk about. The ideas, this modernist idea of the city, of course, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, had the same roots. It was the exchange of ideas that was happening in Europe in the 20s, in the 30s, and that then influenced the thinking in different parts of Europe after the war. And then I think, regardless of the Iron Curtain, you have the same, pretty much the same pattern of this second-hand nostalgia, of this criticism of, because a lot of I'm not trying to say that this vision, this modernist vision for the post-war city was that it had no flaws, that it had no there's a lot to criticize, and some of this postmodern critique was justified, and I think it derived it also on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It had the same reasons, this for instance, the mass house, disappointment with mass housing, that there was one generation raised in the cult of mass housing, of this cult of prefabrication, and then you have another generation that grew up in this constructed dream of mass housing, and began to see the mistakes and the flaws. So I'm not surprised that this change of attitude is pretty much the same in different parts of Europe. Also, this very critical attitude that towards this commercial 19th century structure, this Mitkazana. Well, if you look even at the what was happening in the United States after the war, you also had a lot of entire neighborhoods bulldozed to make way for new neighborhoods and for new housing, because the ideas were the same on both sides of Iron Curtain, and then this generation changed, caused the same changes of attitudes.
Yeah, and funny enough, then the mass housing became commercial.
Yeah,
So you
it
can make a
became
whole lot
commercial.
more money with mass housing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And but I think that in our case here, it's important to get to know this romantic period and learn where all these ideas came from, because now I think we are on another what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a 180-degree change. So we came back to this city that is underplanned, that is falls prey to commercial forces. I know that whenever sometimes when I talk to architects in Germany, that they're frustrated with overplanning. In Poland, the cities are very much underplanned, and this story of planning of post-war Warsaw in the first period, I think it's very educational. It's very it reminds us that it is possible to plan, that it is possible to think of the city in a holistic way, and also to take to prefer the public good or the greater good to commercial interests. Now we are suffering from the opposite. Maybe these visions from 45, 46 were too radical, but now we are radical in a totally opposite way. That I think we, especially after 89, when after the fall of communism, planning was often presented. Any idea of urban planning was presented as a communist leftover. Something that should be gotten rid of as fast as possible. And we dismantled the whole system of urban planning in a dozen years or so. And now our cities are developing as a sum of individual projects, and it's a tragedy.
Oh, yeah. When exactly when the commercialism takes over and makes the decisions for you, then you lose the qualities or control about the qualities in the city. So is that really, let's say, what you would say is now the focal point of the rebuilding of Warsaw, or what would you say as is the vision now of what we can learn from the rebuilding of the early days, yet now today in the end?
That's the first most important lesson I think is that, and it's quite embarrassing to say, is that it is possible to plan, and it's important to discuss about the vision of the city, and it's and to keep on defining the public interest and then act on it, and to try to shape the city, and keeping in mind the public interest. Then I think what I find very refreshing when I look back at this period is this emphasis on the quality of housing. This whole generation of modernist architects who, for them, this was the most important task of architecture, to make functional apartments, to create functional and beautiful and comfortable communities, to plan housing that would inspire people to be together and to make communities safe for children. There was a whole science of building a good community, and some of the best, most livable parts of Warsaw right now come from the post-war period, because there was so much care. They were so carefully planned and built in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Now that the greenery has grown, they are one of the most desired communities. I think that this is, especially here in our context, this quality of housing is very important, because again, housing in Poland is completely commercialized right now. There are very few cooperatives. There is nearly no public housing, neither government housing or municipal housing. And what happens now with this private commercial housing is that it really came back to this pre-war reality that what developers are interested in is density, efficiency, a nice facade that sells the project, and that's it. So long as it conforms to building regulations, the health and safety standards, it's okay. And there's very little thinking of the whole, community and how these individual buildings create a neighborhood. And even though postmodernists then blamed the modernists for not taking enough care, not caring enough for the quality of neighborhoods, in Warsaw it was not the case. They're very well planned, livable and living neighborhoods.
Wow. So basically, as a facet, you're saying that we can learn from what was done, and that instead of this full circle, we need to go again into reevaluating the qualities of the kind of life that we want to have in the city, and that actually so much of that was already achieved in the rebuilding of Warsaw, and so need to take those positive aspects now into the future with more planning.
Definitely more planning and more. I'm not. I don't think you can recreate this situation. It's not possible, and it's not even desired to go back to all the solutions and all the institutions and all the ideas. But it's so important to learn what could be conveyed to the future, and also this enthusiasm and this spirit. I think architecture as a profession now is very disillusioned and does not believe it can change much. I think it's not just a problem in Poland. I think it's the problem of the whole reality, that architects lost a lot of power and feel much more powerless than back then. So that's another important issue. Is it possible to give the architects more power, more credibility? What role could they take on in the society as it is now? I think it's a very interesting question. So there's no going back to 75 years ago. But how could architects get more say, more power, and more faith in our reality, and faith in their abilities.
Oh, I think that's a nice facet and nice place to complete our discussion. Since the rebuilding, as you were saying, didn't stop in 1949, it continues, and it still continues. I think it was fascinating, and there are so many points from which you can now continue on in thinking about how the city proceeds and how the city is constructed in the future, the vision for the future of Warsaw and other cities well. So thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you for the great questions and for the great discussion. I wish you could all read the book. I hope to get it translated one day.
Yes.
Into German or English. Maybe this is the start. And thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.